And what is the current situation on the battlefield?
So the current situation is unfortunately favorable for the Russians largely because of the 6-month delay in the renewal of U.S. military assistance, and the fact that the Ukrainians have run very, very low on artillery shells and very, very low, especially on their defense interceptors. And so the Russians have been leaning in for some weeks, some months now, actually, to take advantage of these Ukrainian vulnerabilities. And they were able to take the town of Avdiivka. Now they're exploiting uh, that success in that area, and they're also pushing west from the city of Bakhmut in what is actually a more alarming drive because they are threatening to take a very important small settlement called Chasiv Yar, that would put the Russians in a good position to threaten what would be sort of called the fortress belt of major cities that uh, are the bulwark that defend eastern Ukraine from further Russian aggression. That having been said, I have the privilege of overseeing the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War, and our combined assessment is that as the aid flows in, the Ukrainians will be able to stabilize their lines and stop this Russian offensive, and very likely be able to receive and ultimately stop the summer Russian offensive as well, although they probably lose some ground in doing so. So the situation now is very tough for Ukraine, but we don't think that the Russians are going to be able to blow things open and really unhinge, big parts of the Ukrainian lines. Let me put it this way. Before the aid package was passed, there was a very wide forecast cone that ran all the way from Russia defeats the conventional Ukrainian military and pulls up on the eastern NATO borders, all the way to Ukraine begins successful counteroffensives. With this aid package right now, those worst case options have fallen out of the forecast cone. So I don't think that there's any plausible scenarios in which the Russians defeat the conventional Ukrainian military at this point. How far can the Ukrainians go? It remains to be seen. The Russians have a lot of vulnerabilities, and it's important to recognize that the Russian advances now result in part from changes and improvements the Russians have made, and we have to avoid talking the Russians down too much. But we also have to recognize that these Russian gains result very heavily from the limitations that have been imposed on Ukraine by the resource starvation that we've put them on, and those will be mitigated. So there are the options are still very wide, but fortunately, some of the worst options I think have fallen out of the forecast cone for now. Definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different outcome. We've tried negotiating with the Russians. We've tried ceasefires with the Russians, and what we got was the full-scale invasion. So the only way that you can actually have this war end other than with a Russian victory is with a Russian defeat. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine wins back every last square meter of its territory, but it does mean that the Russians will have to realize that they have been defeated on the battlefield and that there's not any plausible way for them to recoup their losses on the battlefield by renewing the conflict. The fact that Ukrainians are not going to submit tamely to a Russian occupation in that circumstance. And so the fighting won't stop and the war won't stop. What will happen is the violence on the Ukrainian people will expand dramatically, and you will have probably the largest insurgency in the world break out. And the violence and the fighting will just take another form, but it'll be a form in which many millions more Ukrainians are suffering much worse than they're suffering right now. So this false notion out there that we could somehow pull the plug and that would end the war and bring peace is false to fact, and it really glosses over the viciousness and brutality of what that the Russians are inflicting on Ukrainians in occupied territory every single day. If we show that we are unwilling to spend money to help Ukraine defend itself, what does that say to Xi Jinping about our willingness to spend our blood to defend Taiwan?
Right.
It encourages aggression. It's a bad joke, but it's always true. Ukraine is not Vegas. Uh, if Russia wins in Ukraine, Russia will be stronger. If Russia is stronger, Iran will be stronger, and North Korea will be stronger.